Hey everyone, so today's discussion is going to center around conditioning specifically for basketball athletes. So I think one of the reasons why I like putting out some of this information, it gives the sport coach and athletes along with the parents a different perspective on conditioning, right? I think we all have our own understanding of what conditioning is, whether that's running suicides, going out for a jog, doing battle ropes, doing medicine ball work. There's different things that we can classify as conditioning. But today I'm going to try to make it really simple for the high school sport coach or the athlete, maybe in the off season, as a basketball season for both males and females is slowly coming and rolling along. So today, again, we're going to discuss some principles, and then at the end, I'm going to give you some actual practical advice as to what you could be doing at this moment, getting ready for that season ahead. So when it comes to basketball, I think there's a lot of information on conditioning, but there's nothing that really gives us a kind of a base understanding on how we should be conditioning as athletes, or for the head sport coach, how can we add a conditioning component that's not going to interfere with what we're doing as far as our practices, but it's also going to help prepare the athletes for later within the season towards the playoffs, postseason, and later on even into the championship games, and making sure the athletes are not losing their fitness, right? So the first thing that I like to do when I'm working with athletes, and one thing that I like to kind of give athletes that I'm working with the perspective is, let's look at where are the missing links when it comes to the athlete and what they're currently doing. So right now, everyone's back in school. They're practicing. They're doing their traditional skill work, maybe playing some games, some small-sided games, or even playing some preseason games, right? Off-season just kind of we're still technically moving into the transitional period of getting ready to get the season underway, but the off-season was typically in the summertime, and hopefully during that period of time is where athletes are able to recover. Maybe they're playing in some tournaments and things like that, but they're building up their aerobic system. They're developing that energy system that's going to sustain them throughout the season, right? So first thing we want to look at is, where are we missing as far as the missing links within our conditioning for that given basketball athlete. The very first thing I tend to do is go into some research and try to pull up some studies that actually look at some objective measurements when it comes to the given sport. So there is research on basketball athletes as far as their some of their physiological markers, like their heart rate, the distances that they're covering within a game. So all that stuff can be measured, and I just want to kind of throw that out to kind of begin the discussion. So kind of we have a kind of a baseline as to what we're working on when we're developing our conditioning drills. So in sports strength and conditioning, we look at what is the energy system that is demanded upon that athlete. So in this case, it's going to be basketball, right? So we're trying to look at what is the work to rest ratio within a game, right? So that just means how long, as far as time-wise, or maybe even distances covered, but usually it's going to be time. How long is the athlete working? And the ratio is going to be within how much time are they resting. So, and in this case, as far as kind of if we look at the research, the work to rest ratio is about a 1-to-4. So what that means is that if a basketball player is typically maybe sprinting for 4 seconds, their typical recovery, right, it doesn't mean they're dead stop, but it could be a foul, it could be out of bounds, that type of thing, is going to be a 1-to-4 ratio. So if they're sprinting for 4 seconds, you multiply that by 4, you're resting for about 16 seconds. Usually probably some active rest, right? Walk-ins, light jog-in, maybe you're moving around, getting ready for the next play. So that's the first thing we got to recognize is if we're going to be designing drills for conditioning, we have to know that that's happening, right? So what we can use that information, and if we break it down into seconds, that's basically for every 1 second, 1 to 8 seconds of work, you're going to be resting anywhere from about 4 to 32 seconds, right? It's easy to understand in football because after a play, you're getting a set amount of rest periods before the next play. So you go to the huddle, and then there's a given, as soon as there's a dead ball, you have X amount of time on the play clock before the next play has to take place. Not so much in basketball, but if you can kind of visualize that, typically think of basketball as a sport that you're going to be going very fast, but for very short distances. And that's what we term the alactic energy system. It's that very high intensity sprint, and then you're going to combine that with going slow over a longer period of time, and that's where the aerobic system. So that's where we can distinguish the differences between those high intensity bursts versus that recovery period. Just know that all the energy systems are always working, but we're going to be relying heavily on one at certain time periods. Let's just say a turnover, the athlete has to turn and sprint. Now we're working on that high intensity component, so that alactic component, where we got to produce massive amounts of energy in a very short period of time, and then maybe the athlete gets to the end, gets fouled, and now they're recovering for 30 to 40 seconds, maybe shooting their free throws, or maybe they're going to inbound the ball, right? So we have to understand that. And when it comes to basketball, it's a combination of very high intensity bursts. So it could be a sprint, it could be a jump, it could be a cut, change of directions, and things like that. And then also medium intensity workloads. So we're talking like a jog, maybe it's a turnover and the athlete is jogging to the other end of the court about to play defense. And then also low intensity. So meaning if there's a foul, so everyone's standing around kind of waiting for that free throw. It could be stoppage of time, so it can be a timeout where you're sitting on the bench. It could be out of bounds play where the whistle is blown and then you're walking towards the other side of the court before the next ball is in play, right? So we have to look at that sport as it's a mixture of everything. I think sometimes everyone looks at basketball as only being high intensity, but when we look at actual research that looks at the sport, here's what we can come up with. So from a high intensity, meaning sprints and jumps, athletes are in that kind of zone anywhere from 2 to 20% of the time, right? So not a lot, right? 2 to 20%, you're in that high intensity zone. In the medium zone, you're about 17 to 68% of the time. And then in the low zone, you're about 30 to 72%. So if you look at those statistics, the majority of the time is spent in the moderate, medium to low intensity zones with very short bursts of high intensity sprints, right? I think a lot of times either sport coaches or parents or athletes might think it's a high intensity sport all the time. But if you look at the sport, next time you're watching a basketball game, even soccer as well, look at how much of the time there's actually not spent sprinting. So it's a majority of the time is in that zone. So we have to understand that. And then lastly, when we look at some statistics, they looked at how much from a time perspective is how long does a play typically last? And what they found was about 51% of the time it lasted longer. The high intensity part, about 1.5 seconds. 27% of the time lasted longer than 2 seconds. 12% longer than 3 seconds, and 5% longer than 4 seconds. So what does that mean? That means that if a basketball athlete is going to get into that high intensity zone, it's going to be for a very short period of time. I mean, 50% of the time, they're sprinting for 1.5 seconds throughout the game, right? Short little bursts over a long period of time, right? So they're not in that high intensity zone that much. Right, but when they do need to turn it on, they need to be able to turn it on, and that's what we're going to discuss kind of the next phase. So, for as far as the high intensity, it's basically 1 out of every 7 seconds. So they're performing a high intensity burst one time for every 7 seconds, right? And you got to look at the sport as not just, a lot of times people are concerned with how fast they are over, 100 meters. But when it comes to basketball, this sport is about transition. It's about acceleration, deceleration, change of direction, reacceleration. So it's constantly start, stop, start, stop. So if you're only focused on how fast you can go 100 meters, you're never going to reach that speed. You're not going to cover that distance. And I think it's about 30 meters is usually the longest a basketball athlete is going to tend to sprint, 30 meters, right? So you're not going to be sprinting that far, so you're not going to have enough time to reach max levels of velocity as far as sprint time. So my recommendation is spending more time in that acceleration and deceleration phase of an athlete's training versus just how fast you can run for longer, 100 meters or covering that much ground, because it's not going to happen within the sport. Now, does that mean you should never work on your top end speed? Probably you should be doing some of that, but the majority of your training should be in that acceleration phase, right? Now let's look at heart rate. So I love looking at heart rate data. It gives us an idea as to how much of the time is spent in certain zones. And when we look at the data in game, and I believe this is professional athletes, in game heart rate averages around 175 beats per minute. So that's pretty high, and that's average, right? With a range of about 155 to about 189 beats per minute. And the heart rate is typically higher in the first half compared to the second half. So when we're looking at these heart rates, so if you're a basketball athlete and you do have access to a heart rate monitor, I would encourage you to wear it during a practice, even during a game if you can get away with it, and see how much of that time you're spending in those higher intensity thresholds, right? But here's the thing is, like we talked about earlier, is you're probably only spending short distances sprinting, but the reason your heart rate remains elevated is because you have short recovery bouts, right? You're not getting, 2 minutes of complete rest. You might get 10, 20 seconds of rest before you got to turn it up again. So that can give us some information as far as your conditioning. If I have an athlete and their average heart rate is in the 180s, well, I want them to get comfortable in that heart rate. So I might, whether it's in the gym or in the basketball gym, I might be getting some conditioning drills where I want them at that 180 beats per minute and get them comfortable there for a few, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 45 seconds, and then maybe have them shoot some free throws so they get used to what it feels like to be in that threshold, and then eventually we can improve that. So maybe instead of them, if their fitness improves, and they're spending, maybe they drop that to 175, that means they're using less energy, which is going to sustain them from fatiguing towards a later part of the game, right? So we have to be very conscious of, and every athlete's different. Every coach's scheme is different. So if I'm working with a coach who likes to push the pace, hey, their aerobic fitness needs to be so much better than maybe a team that likes to, get the ball across half court, settle down, and then, start running plays and that sort, because the other coach wants to push. So they're going to have to be recovering relatively quickly between these bouts of high intensity bursts. So that tells me that aerobic system, which is the system that helps you recover between bouts, needs to be very robust. And that happens in the off season. That means that you're building that aerobic system out of season, and then you're transitioning into more high intensity type workloads. So that aerobic system is your foundation, and it's helping you recover between these short bursts of high intensity bouts. So you got to make sure you're spending that time in the off season building that aerobic system. And it could be playing pickup ball. It doesn't have to be just, hopping on a treadmill and running for miles, but there have to be some lower intensity exercises in there. It can't always be high intensity because these are different systems that we're working. So you got to spend the time in the off season developing that base, and then transitioning into the season into what we can do as far as high intensity bursts with X amount of rest periods, and then your ability to repeat that over a given period of time. Okay. So now from a practical standpoint, how do we do this, right? There's different ways you can go about, but if you're a high school sport coach that maybe doesn't have access to a gym and have access to bikes and treadmills and that type of thing, you can easily have a team, with some medicine balls, and maybe have them do a short sprint for 3-4 seconds, and then have them do some active recovery for about 30 seconds. So remember we talked about earlier is that 1-to-4 ratio. So if I have an athlete sprint for 5 seconds, I want about 20 seconds of rest or active rest. You know, they can be doing some calisthenics, some push-ups, sit-ups, some squats at a lower intensity, making sure that recovery is taking place, jumping jacks, or even better, what I like to do, or what I would have sport coaches do, and they probably already do it as well, but have them sprint for 5-6 seconds, get them on the free throw line and have them execute some free throws. Right, I think that's been around for some time, and it's just teaching the athlete both how to bring their heart rate down, recover, and shoot some free throws after a given sprint, which is gonna take place during a game. So there's so many ways that you can put together conditioning workouts, but it starts with understanding what conditioning actually is and what it's not. It's not just running suicides endlessly, because that's not what they're going to experience within a game. If you're just doing suicides, that means you're doing a lot of things that are not max intent, max effort, right? So when you're asking an athlete to sprint hard during a game, they don't know what it feels like to sprint hard because they know they've been doing suicides. Even though they're sprinting kind of hard, they can't go all out because they're going to gas out. They have a time period they got to get back, so they're holding some in the tank. But when you tell an athlete, hey, I want you to sprint max for 5 seconds because you're going to get some recovery, they'll sprint for 5 seconds with max intent. Now you're training those maximum motor units that are going to turn on because it's only 5 seconds of absolute maximum work, and the athlete knows they're going to get some recovery in between. So there's a difference between just running suicides and running lines versus being purposeful and actually knowing what the purpose of that given conditioning session is all about. That's where you're going to get maximum results. You're going to get athletes getting injured less. You're going to improve their technique because they're not just doing conditioning, one as a form of punishment or just to do it for the sake. There's no technique involved when they're not doing it for purpose. You're also going to get their ability to recover a lot better between fouls and timeouts and when the whistle blows, and they're able to recover much better than their opponents, right? So the conditioning is there for a purpose, not just to hammer them. And you got to also, as far as programming goes, during the season, they're getting a lot of their conditioning already with games. So that means in your practices, you can implement some conditioning stuff, but I would probably do some lower level type stuff, more aerobic, because they're getting that high intensity stuff already within the games. So there's no need to completely do that again on their off days, and you're just hammering. At some point, they're going to break. So during the season, once they have games, use that as your high intensity conditioning. When they get back the next day, you do your practice and then maybe do some low level, 20-minute circuits where it's just kind of lower intensity, maybe you're doing some core work, some mobility stuff, but it's helping them facilitate recovery, not just drilling them deeper in the hole, because then when they show up later in the week for another game, they're going to be getting into feeling fatigue and injured. Technique's not as good, so you got to know when to program. Off season, you can get them pretty good. You can do a lot of volume in that off season if they're not playing competitive games. Now, as the season approaches, now we start to become much more specific, and we use the sport in ways that we can condition that athlete. And if they're actually playing games, now that becomes conditioning in itself, and now we're just going to find ways on the days off to facilitate recovery, not to just do more damage. Okay, so hopefully this little segment helped sport coaches, athletes, other trainers, and parents understand what conditioning is and what conditioning is not. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it on the comments. Reach out to me on Instagram. It's going to be Coach_Jerry with a J _. I love talking about conditioning. I love talking shop and learning from others. So if you disagree with me, I would love to have that conversation as well. Just being in an environment of just learning, bouncing some ideas, maybe what has worked for you in the past. Let me know. I'm always open to learning and hearing other people's perspectives. But hopefully, again, big key points is they understand that basketball is high intensity over short periods of time, mixed in with low intensity over longer periods of time. So that means the aerobic system is very important. When you're doing conditioning, try to make sure you're mindful of those work to rest ratios. It can't just be hammer. Have some maximal 5-second intense sprints followed by about 20 seconds of recovery. active or just regular rest, doesn't really matter. Depends on what you're working at. Off season should be geared towards developing that aerobic base. So with that way, in season, we're able to recover within between games, but also between plays. All right, so again, any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. Thank you for your time, for listening. Hopefully you got some value from this video. And next time we're going to be discussing different sports. Okay, so my goal is to develop these little short segments and get to the point as far as what conditioning we can do with certain sports, male or female. And next time we'll probably do something like on volleyball. I think that's an interesting sport, a little bit different than basketball because you're not covering that much distance. But till next time, hopefully you got some value. Thank you for your support. I would love for you to like this video, subscribe if you can. That way you're getting these notifications when I'm putting out some new video. All right, so see everyone later, and thank you again for your time, and I'll talk to you later.